Hey everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which focuses on how real-world data propels innovation in oncology R&D, commercialization, and beyond. I'm Vera Muchay. I'm Head of Trials and Chief Scientist here at Datavant, and I will be your host for today. As a reminder, here at Datavant, our mission is to connect the world's health data to improve patient outcomes. We provide technology that helps healthcare data users link data in a privacy-preserving manner. And that technology today is used across the largest real-world data ecosystem, which powers a growing number of important oncology use cases. So with that in mind, it is my pleasure to host this webinar today and welcome a great group of oncology experts. So I'll give a brief intro to each and we can get the conversation started. Before I do that, I'm sure everybody who's joining us today is very familiar with how these webinars go. There will be a recording at the end of it that will go to all participants. But while you're here, we want to make sure that this conversation is as interactive as possible. You are welcome to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window to ask questions, and we'll incorporate those questions either during the conversation or at the end of our webinar today. So great. So again, it's my pleasure to introduce Jeff, Lauren, and Sean. So I'll start with Jeff, who is the President and CEO of Friends of Cancer Research, which drives collaboration across healthcare to power advances in science, policy, and regulation that speed life-saving treatments for patients. Jeff serves as a board member and was previously president of the Alliance for Stronger FDA, and board chair of the Medical Evidence Development Consortium. He is a LongMap senior leadership team member, participates in working groups convened by the National Academies of Medicine and the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. Welcome, Jeff. Next, I'll introduce Lauren. Lauren Becknell is Vice President of Real World Evidence Center of Excellence at Pfizer. She has over 20 years of experience in biomedical science, healthcare, and innovative technologies. Previously, Lauren serves as Pfizer Global Oncology Real-World Evidence Lead, as the Vice President of Global Strategy and Innovation at the Clinical Data Interchange Standards Consortium. And before that, she was Head of Biomedical and Health Informatics at Baylor College of Medicine and the NCI-designated Duncan Comprehensive Cancer Center. Welcome, Lauren. And then finally, I'll be introducing Sean. Sean Cousin is the Chief Executive Officer of CancerlinQ and Executive Vice President at ASCO. His leadership experience spans health technology, regulation, clinical research, and data science. Previously, Sean served as the Global Head of Data Strategy and Data Science Innovation at Janssen R&D of Johnson & Johnson. And prior to that, he led the FDA Oncology Center of Excellence's bioinformatics, regulatory science, and clinical trial innovation efforts. So as you can see today, we have a very well-esteemed group of panelists. It is my pleasure to be in your company, and thanks again for joining us today. So to get us started, I just want to kind of go around the group and discuss what actually excites you about real-world data in oncology today. So let's start with Jeff.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to join you all today. It's a real pleasure to be here. I think there's so many things that have changed in the last few years, whether that's because of the technological capability to capture data more readily or the expansive efforts across the entire healthcare sector to figure out ways to use that. But in oncology, I think we're seeing a lot of expansion on the historic uses of real-world data, which in many ways were to better characterize or identify safety events, which of course it still plays an important role in that. But even expanding to leverage capabilities at things like, maybe to mention a few use case areas that we've been involved in. One being the ability to learn more about patients that weren't perhaps included in the original clinical trials, and important efforts underway to better understand different subpopulations, different outcomes and experiences that can be had by the people who ultimately are using these medical products, many of whom for various reasons, may not have been involved in the original clinical studies. I think that's been a historic challenge in oncology, with relatively stably low rates of clinical trial participation, which really speaks to the need of finding ways to grow that evidentiary base over time as more people use the products. Number two, where I think there's great opportunity could be around things like clinical trial efficiency. That could take a whole host of different shapes, looking at things like a better understanding of the natural history of different diseases to design better trials, or even thinking about the use of real world data to augment current clinical trials, things like external controls that could help inform different study designs. Frequently in oncology, early stage or even later stage trials rely on single arm observational trials. And if those can be augmented by, a more coordinated effort to have, additional information alongside, that could be very powerful. And then a third area that I think we've seen increased utilization and perhaps growing opportunity is around things like confirming benefit of drugs. Obviously in oncology, with many different therapeutic areas that still unmet medical needs that still exist, it's really important to think about ways to expedite the development and delivery of these products. With that comes the responsibility to continue to learn about them over time. And I think real world data can be a incredibly important tool in the arsenal to continue learning. Particularly in thinking about rare patient subsets or even drugs that that show a high degree of activity very early on, where doing some of those confirmatory studies may be particularly challenging. So lots of opportunities, lots to do, but I think it's a very exciting time.
Wonderful, thanks, Jeff. And we'll talk through some of these spaces as part of the conversation. Lauren, on your end, thinking of it from sort of the pharma sponsor's point of view, what's exciting to you? Lauren, I believe you may be on mute.
I was, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to join. I think Jeff really hit the nail on the head on a number of points that I would roll up into just the opportunity to better understand patients and their diseases. There are, of course, applications for that in early R&D space, late phase development, medical affairs type interactions with patient advocacy groups or sites, healthcare sites. And then, of course, from a commercial perspective. I think excited about some recent changes, such as the CMS interoperability rule, to see where that really takes us now that we're having this increasing patient centricity with patients having the ability to pull data out of various electronic medical record systems, at least in a limited way, to have the right to request that payers provide them with their medical information, and to be able to collate that and transport that, I think is really exciting. And it's a key step for us to continue to put patients first and to put patients at the center of what we're doing, which I think in the past, maybe that was less possible just due to some technology limitations. Also, I think this increasing focus on racial equity in research and of course in care. There's been a lot of work done around racial inequities in the US from a healthcare perspective. I think we are now at Pfizer, of course, deeply committed to increasing equity and representation within our clinical trials. And real world data can be one of the measures through which we do it. That's a complicated issue, of course. And that information is not always available, but where it is, it's very empowering. And then I think maybe the last piece would be the ability to digitize care guidelines and to have that be embedded within medical record systems, or perhaps systems that live on top of that, to be able to help physicians to manage what can be a dizzying array of changes that are occurring quite frequently with many disparate types of information, to get that comprehensive view of what's happening with their patient in order to really have compliance with evidence-based medicine. And of course, real world evidence can contribute towards that evidence that would be driving and improving patient outcomes and care.
Wonderful, thanks, Lauren, and wholeheartedly agree. I think we're at an inflection point right now where technology is there, where we can do a lot more with real world data. both in terms of completeness, but also in terms of ameliorating how we include more diverse populations into our research processes. And then finally, Sean, what about you?
Thank you, Vera. It's great to be here. I think Jeff and Lauren very nicely covered a lot of important themes that I agree with. And the way I think about real-world data is essentially it's big data. And if we define big data computationally, it has 4 V's, 4 axes or dimensions. That's variety, veracity, volume, and velocity. What's quite exciting that in the past 2 years alone, real-world data, thinking about it as big data, has tremendously progressed and improved along the 4 computational axes, along the 4 V's. For example, in terms of data variety, we're now able to ingest and extract more diverse data sets from the real world. Initially, we started with electronic health record data and whatever was in those electronic health records. And now we're expanding the types of data we're collecting. For example, we're starting to collect genomic data. And in cases where we had analog data assets, such as histopathology, which were basically biospecimens on a slide. A lot of centers in the United States and worldwide are digitizing their biospecimens. So we're starting to ingest and extract digital histopathology data from the point of care. So the variety of data that we can extract just in the past 2 years alone has improved and increased. With that, the data veracity has also become a little more complex. So the needs on that axis have changed. In terms of data volume, clearly the volume of data that we're ingesting today far exceeds the volume of data because of the different data types that we're able to extract today a couple of years ago. So in terms of volume, the volume of data is exponentially growing. And perhaps most importantly, the velocity, meaning velocity as a computational concept, how quickly are we generating data, extracting data, and analyzing it. That velocity has also improved tremendously because of our ability to be able to more efficiently extract the data. Lauren mentioned the CMS and ONC interoperability rules that allow API-based mechanisms of data extraction, much speedier, much more efficient. And as we extract data more efficiently, we're able to analyze it more efficiently with greater velocity. So I think there's a lot has happened the past couple of years that makes the domain of real-world evidence quite exciting. And I think this is just the beginning. And over the next 5 years, there are a lot of exciting new developments that I'm looking forward to.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Sean. I love the mnemonic of the 4 V's in terms of thinking about real-world data. And as I listened, I was taking some notes as you guys were talking about what excites you the most. And I see a lot of themes around, to use Lauren's point, around really better understanding the patient. And I'll add sort of what excites me, and especially here at Datavant, about real-world data is real-world data connectivity to really have that holistic view of the patient. As we think about oncology, we have this panel group that comes from very different points of view. But also, if we think of oncology as a therapeutic area, that is not a monolith, right? There's lots of different diseases. Many patients are impacted. We all know one or more loved ones who have been cancer patients. And there's various levels of unmet need, and also various levels of how real-world data and real-world evidence is being used right now. So I'm very excited to see how we navigate certain points here, but I want to first talk about what we're doing in the present. So like, even as we look at oncology as being this very diverse group of diseases, I'm curious to see from your point of view, what has worked right now? What kind of use cases are being supported or can be supported with real world data today? And Lauren, would you like to get us started?
Certainly. So, I think that there is a pretty broad set of use cases that can be supported. So I will not try and venture into every last one of them, but maybe give a few highlights. So I think certainly just broadly trials optimization, whether that is better informed site identification, patient identification, informed trial design. Certainly there is the potential to, with a small p, pragmatically designed trials now to better align them where possible to standard of care without sacrificing our ability to establish causality for trials. And then, I think Jeff already mentioned external control arms and things like long-term follow-up. So kind of reducing the burden on sites and on patients, but also having a longer-term perspective of how people are faring with different medications in different situations. From a medical perspective, definitely, I think it enables more focused conversation about quality, for example. Also, I'll just put in a plug for the palbociclib team. So the IBRANCE team, as many of you on the call know, of course, had some major success with real world evidence for a label expansion for males. However, in that case, real world evidence was not the deciding factor, to be clear. We still cannot look at real world evidence from an efficacy perspective, more like an effectiveness perspective. And there are certain attributes to the patient populations from the clinical trials, the amount of real world evidence that had been collected on effectiveness and safety, and then the male patient population from real world data sources that are somewhat unique. And so this is not something that would be reproduced 1,000 times over in the near future, to be fair. Of course, industry is using real world evidence and has been using real world data for quite some time to inform internal business decisions, to track how many patients are using which medications, are patients staying on medications per guidelines, to be able to understand those kinds of issues. And then last but not least, there are a number of ways in which real world data can be used to understand total costs of care, outcomes of patients with different types of care settings, and then how do we work with not only registrational agencies, but also, of course, health technology authorities and payers to present information that may be different from a registrational filing, but includes more patient-centric variables, for example. So it really runs the gamut.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And I tend to agree that if we're looking at real world data and how it's being used sort of on the post-approval side, there's a lot more history there, and then there's a lot more advancements. Do you see the R&D component of how real world data is used today gets to that kind of level of usage and advancements in the near future?
Yeah, I think certainly the industry in general is interested in going that direction. We and many of our colleagues at other companies certainly have invested substantially in real world data for early discovery or early clinical development spaces. I think that there will probably be more work done in that area in the future. I will say that when you're thinking about it's maybe perhaps easier for something like HER2 positive breast cancer, because that is a marker that is collected routinely. To Sean's point, it was maybe non-digitized in the past, but it's not impossible to get that information out. What can become more challenging in that space is if one is looking at a very precise genetic biomarker or a very rare patient population, or trying to understand things that would just occur longitudinally. I think there's a lot of interest in our colleagues in understanding mechanisms of resistance and what's happening within a given patient's tumor. And that doesn't always align with standard of care. So some of that is really, I think, going to be more difficult, if not impossible, for the next 5 years to tackle.
Got it. That's helpful. And Jeff, you were talking earlier about confirming benefits and about some novel usage, such as around external control arms. Do you, based on your research, do you see that type of work as here to stay? Do you see it as emerging? What's your perspective there?
Yeah, I think those are two areas that hold a great deal of potential. Some of it I think still requires some degree of methodological exploration in terms of how to consistently do that, or maybe even some standardization in terms of what data elements would be critical in order to be successful for using real world data for those particular use cases. But I think that while in clinical trials, we are used to having a degree of consistency and standardization and common approaches, that's sort of being tested, or at least the boundaries are being pushed a little bit, due to the uniqueness of different data sources that need to be accounted for in designing these types of studies. And I think that's important to recognize. Over the last couple of years, we've had the great fortune of working with a number of different data partners across the oncology and healthcare spectrum, Sean's current organization included, looking at a couple of different pilot projects to explore the extent to which different real world endpoints can be characterized. With one of the challenges being in oncology that frequently relied upon endpoints in clinical trials, such as tumor responsiveness or progression-free survival, or frankly, even overall survival, can be difficult measures to extract from electronic healthcare data in many instances. So what we had worked on with our data partners in this area was to explore the feasibility of different endpoints that might be able to be indicators of either response or even benefit in certain situations. Looking at things like treatment duration, like time to next treatment or time to treatment discontinuation as potential proxies for when a patient might discontinue therapy. And while those are less precise measures than what would be used to determine tumor progression, I think there's still interesting potential there. When you think about reasons that a patient might discontinue treatment, one might be because that treatment was so successful. Another might be because their tumor had progressed and their care team determined that they should try a different therapy. The other might be due to intolerability of the treatment over time. In all of those instances, those pose very different reasons for discontinuing treatment, but they may also quantify or be able to collectively quantify which treatment is actually providing benefit. If you're able to tolerate it, you're able to continue, hopefully, the anti-cancer effect of it. If you're able to stay on it longer, the same, and perhaps it hasn't been determined that your disease has progressed. So while these may not be perfectly fit for regulatory purposes, to Lauren's point, there may be different uses for this type of data in thinking about how to measure in larger populations, beneficial outcomes for things like assessing long-term value of some of these products, over time, and the different measures that might be required to successfully do so, and really encapsulate what the patients are experiencing.
Right. No, that is very important and very helpful. And maybe for another conversation, but I'm curious to know also, like, as we're thinking about these emerging endpoints, how do we get close to have the same or very similar endpoints in a clinical trial and in a real world data set? So perhaps we have that as part of another conversation, because I feel like that merits a discussion in and of itself. And Sean, I know we've talked in the past about clinical trial democratization and then data democratization in general. Sitting where you are right now, sort of at CancerlinQ, what do you see being done well now, and what do you see that's emerging?
Sure. I think one of the benefits of the movement around real world data and real world evidence has been that it's increased our improve our perspective on what is possible. And I think we used to have two different worlds that essentially did the same thing, but in different ways. We had the clinical research world, and we had the care delivery world. And then, and these were very separate entities several decades ago. More recently, they've started to converge. A lot of clinical investigators now that, in fact, in the same office, in the same practice, in the same locality, they see standard of care patients because of changes to reimbursement and market dynamics, healthcare system market dynamics. And then add to that the idea that now we can use data from the point of care to advance clinical development and R&D programs. We're starting to see the arbitrary sort of delineations that have been really are now almost artifacts of history rather than objective realities that separate clinical research from healthcare delivery. So outside of early stage, those finding studies and translational studies that are exploratory and truly research, the majority of clinical trials are essentially closer to patient treatment and collecting data and making sure that the audit trails are in place versus exploring the unknown, translational or research that is based on exploration of the unknown. Sure, there's equipoise, and the results of this study would inform us about the safety and efficacy of the treatment or modality. So that realization is that mindset shift and that psychological transition perhaps has been one of the most significant parts of being part of this whole real-world evidence ecosystem. Because what we're starting to see, we're in over 100 health systems and community practices. Some of our community practices don't engage in clinical trials. And now they're starting to realize that we can do this. We can collect data prospectively using the tools and technologies that are available to us today to treat patients where they are. And I think that's been one of the major sort of advances and perhaps unintended benefits of the real-world data and evidence movement. So what does that mean? Well, it means that we've done a lot in recent years to expand eligibility criteria in order to improve clinical trial recruitment. However, even though these efforts are quite meaningful and quite effective, still the number one barrier to clinical trial participation is financial toxicity as a result of travel and just commuting to a clinical trial site. So now, for those of us that are very much embedded at the point of care and realize and have had this change in perspective and mindset and have realized that a clinical trial is nothing more than an exercise in data collection, prospective data collection. And if we can leverage the retrospective data to identify the patients that could be eligible for a clinical study and then empower the point of care to collect the data that is needed on the same patient prospectively as part of a clinical research program is an opportunity that is empowering us to extend the reach of clinical investigations to underserved communities, and especially in areas with high density of minority populations who we know are underrepresented in traditional clinical trials. And that democratization of clinical research is going to happen. It's inevitable. And the reason that it's inevitable, it has less to do with technology, but this shift in perspective and mindset and this psychological sort of evolution that a lot of us have experienced in recent years that is clearly showing the opportunities that we have to collect data prospectively at the point of care that comes very close and in some cases it could exceed the body of evidence that we're generating from traditional clinical trials. So that, to me, is quite an exciting opportunity and quite an exciting future to be able to democratize clinical research and extend the reach of clinical investigations to underserved communities.
That is very helpful, and that would be a very powerful future. And one of the things that I love asking is sort of the flip side of the question, which is what should we do more of today, but we aren't. And I think, Sean, your answer kind of covers that as well. And I'd like to ask the panelists that question, but focus it on data types and data availability. So if we're looking at what we have at hand today to generate real-world evidence, what should we do more but aren't, and what can't we do because the data is perhaps not there? And Sean, I don't know if you have any comments that you wanted to add on that.
So what can we do today? Well, there's a lot that I think folks mentioned that we can do today, and I think our ability to do more will exponentially increase over the next year or two because of all the things that were already mentioned. You know, our ability to extract more data. But I think one of the most important things that we need to do, we need to understand data quality in order to be confident about the results that we're producing from real-world data at the point of care. So this whole theme of quality is rather, it's not as straightforward as people think. What is quality? What is data integrity? Above what threshold can you be confident in saying that this data is of high quality? What are the measures? What can we measure to really understand data quality? Perhaps, and I think what we need to do is actually turn focus to data that we're generating as part of traditional clinical trials. What is data quality in traditional clinical trials? How do we define data quality in traditional clinical trials? What is the threshold under which we deem data emerging from a clinical trial no longer valid? When we do that, we realize that, well, there are really no definitions, even for quality when it comes to clinical trial data. We trust clinical trial data because of the procedures that we've implemented in terms of how we extract data, how we make sure that there's audit trails, and the fact that when we submit an NDA or a BLA to regulatory authorities, we attest. There's one paragraph, it's a legal document that sponsors of clinical research sent to the FDA and other regulatory authorities, attest to following normal standards, including good clinical practice guidelines. And that assurance basically is part of gaining trust in the data we're generating in clinical trials. Obviously, there are site inspections and regulatory authorities basically do clinical site inspections. And essentially what that entails is, you know, I'm simplifying to a certain extent, random audits on and source document verification. Well, there's no reason we can't do that with real world data. And if we start to apply the same procedures and standards around how we extract data retrospectively and prospectively. Lauren mentioned palbociclib. I happened to be at the FDA when FDA approved palbociclib, and it was that recognition that, well, it's really just about source document verification. And when we had that recognition at the FDA, you know, the palbociclib story was a story that was quite complex. And once that recognition was there, it became quite evident how to trust the real world part of the submission, and everything went very quickly from there. So I think to answer your question, it's really, you know, we have to start to think about data quality, and Jeff also mentioned endpoints, and how can we generate endpoints that mathematically align with the types of endpoints that we're extracting from, we're generating and relying on in traditional clinical research.
Thank you. And Jeff, is there anything else that you wanted to add on the endpoints component? And then Lauren, I have a question about you, particularly about data.
Well, I think that the goal of the endpoints project was, exploratory to see and really just pressure test how well these endpoints correlated to things that we are traditional measures from clinical trials. Interestingly, what we found across several of the groups that participated in the pilot was things like time to treatment discontinuation correlated quite well to real world survival, about the same extent that real world progression did. So I think it's important to, while I wholeheartedly agree with all of the things that Sean has described about the importance for data quality and understanding the level of quality behind the data, to some extent, I think we also have to just try and recognize that even with all of the quality standards that are in place for clinical trials, sometimes the results of clinical trials aren't explainable. Sometimes if you see clinical trials that were run very similarly, I think you'd see differences between the observations, even if you tried to run 3 concurrent clinical trials on 3 different equally selected populations. You might see differences in outcomes in those cases as well. So that's not to say that they're unreliable. It just means they're the standard that we have. But I think within the spirit of sort of not letting perfect be the enemy of the good, we have to think about, if we're going to advance real world evidence, pressure testing and trying and being realistic about the limitations and thinking about the methodology, and maybe even trying to do some of this in tandem, add some of these real world measures into ongoing clinical trials to understand how they're performing side by side in real time. That might provide additional insight. Doesn't mean they have to be exactly the same by any means, but it could provide additional insights into those observations. And ultimately with the goal of trying to further understand what you're seeing in less known case studies around the real world data. That was one of the reasons that the groups we were working with selected sort of a known case study. We looked at a situation in non-small cell lung cancer comparing use of immuno-oncology containing regimens versus chemotherapy. The clinical trials had already been done. The goal of the project wasn't to re-adjudicate those clinical trials. It was really to sort of take a trusted known and then start to pressure test. Well, if you tried to repeat that in real world data, what were some of the observations and limitations that occurred?
Yeah, it's just a quick comment, Jeff. I'm glad you brought that up. I completely agree, and I hope my focus on quality wasn't discouraging. In fact, I was trying to encourage people to venture into generating real-world insights and relying on those insights, and doing what we can to trust the data, because as you said, the clinical trial world is also messy, and there are no definitions for data quality in clinical trials. It's procedural, and we raise our right hand, we attest that we did things the right way, and then there's clinical site inspections that do some source document verification. And here's the reality actually of what happens with those site inspections. There are always protocol deviations. There's always data missingness. And we're talking about traditional clinical trials. There's always discrepancies between what you see in the electronic health record and what's on the case report form. However, as long as there's no fraud, regulatory authorities are comfortable. So clinical trial data is very messy. Perhaps that's part of the reason why if you repeated the same study, it may not work, or you may get different results, as Jeff, you mentioned. So I completely agree. We should not let perfect be the enemy of good, because the traditional clinical trials by no means are perfect. In fact, that's one of the main reasons why it's so hard to develop evidence-based guidelines. We've been trying to do this for decades. Why can't we do it? Because we cannot rely on the body of clinical evidence generated from traditional clinical trials to develop guidelines that apply to the entire population of cancer patients, because the majority of cancer patients are not represented in clinical trials. And for the oncologist that has to personalize treatment decisions at the point of care, frankly, looking at the FDA label is not very helpful, because that's in most oncology trials are in a small minority of cancer patients, 3% of cancer patients. And for the oncologist, I'm not saying the FDA labels are not useful, but for the oncologist, how would they make personalized treatment decisions by looking at median and average treatment effects in a population of patients that really looks nothing like the patient that's sitting in front of them, typically sicker, ECOG performance status of 2 and above. Those are the majority of cancer patients, typically older and typically from more diverse backgrounds. How could that oncologist really use that label to personalize treatment decisions? So what are oncologists doing today? Still to this day, they rely on clinical judgment and intuition. They think about the patient that they've treated just like the patient that's sitting in front of them the day before or the week before. If they can identify that anecdotal experiential evidence, they call their friends. So that's how oncology is practiced in a lot of ways. That's why it's so hard to bring evidence-based guidelines. So we need real-world evidence in order to improve quality of care and to improve the body of clinical evidence that's needed to inform oncologists and to really develop guidelines that are meaningful to the patient as an individual and to the oncologist who's responsible for the health and well-being of that individual. And that oncologist cannot make their decisions based on Kaplan-Meier curves or median average treatment effects.
Right. Indeed, we need that real-world evidence, and wanted to pass the next question to Lauren, because I know we've discussed this in the past. So to have that real-world evidence, you need the right real-world data. I love your analogy of how you think about real-world data available today, sort of as a layer cake. And I'm curious if you could share some of that with this group and talk a little bit about what kind of data would be really killer data for a pharma sponsor or researcher today.
Sure. So I think, of course, I mentioned this earlier, having truly deep clinical genomic data where there is meaningful clinical and pathological information, but also depth in the genomic side or transcriptomic side. That today does not exist at scale. Certainly one can create registries or can create data sets to do that, but it typically is, to your point, required to pull together data from different sources. Maybe sometimes companies are doing that a priori. Other times, sponsors have to do that legwork themselves. I think just stepping back from that kind of Euclidean ideal state for many oncology indications, the kinds of data that we tend to be most comfortable with, I guess, in a real world data space would be medical or pharmacy claims. There's a large number of patients, but the depth of data that you get is very low. And so while you can address things such as total cost of care, you can't really deeply understand, well, which subtype of patients would see the most benefit. So from there, of course, we tend to look to electronic medical records or electronic health records data. That is not a complete data set. As Sean was mentioning earlier, I think while there have been major improvements, there still are quality gains. Not every lab value is going to be present, even though you might have a very complete medical record from an availability perspective. Other data also could be missing or incomplete. And so I think then you have on top of that, the ability to think about curation of those medical records and to pull out things such as progression, such as real world recurrence. That is difficult. I think you are asking about challenges. I think a continued challenge while we are looking at kind of trial-based traditional endpoints is that there has been no solution that works at scale to pull those measures out of a medical record with any degree of accuracy. And apologies to anyone who has nailed this, I'm not aware of it. And so I think that puts us in a position where as the amount of data is increasing, we also are pulling in more and more expert curators as a community, which is challenging. People get saturated. There's not an unlimited population of individuals who have the medical or biological knowledge to be able to do that accurately. And so I think that's going to be a bottleneck continually. Having said that, there's always new technologies around the corner to make things easier. One of the ways that we can do that now is by looking at the medical records, looking at various external sources of lab values, looking at medical pharmacy administrative claims, and being able to pull that together to have a much more complete perspective on patient journeys, and therefore be able to reach more meaningful conclusions than you would perhaps from any one data source alone. And so that's, I think, really exciting. And it's, in total, I guess that would be the slice of cake that you'd want to take and eat. But it's exciting to me that we are beginning to chip away meaningfully at the silos that had existed in various different types of sources of real world data.
And just because you mentioned lab data and genomic data, rather, the way I think about it, there's the commercial data, and then there's also the research data at the large academic medical centers, et cetera. I think it would be very interesting to see how those sources sort of like get blended and get linked in the future, and how those sources get linked to the rest of a patient's medical record to really be able to tell that holistic story. So I welcome that kind of collaboration for sure. Yeah, so given that we're kind of coming at the last 10 minutes of this conversation, I wanted to switch gears a little bit, and I see quite the number of questions here from our participants. I'm going to pick a couple to discuss with the group today, and because we don't have time to answer all of them, we'll make sure to get back to the rest of the folks offline. But first, we talked a lot about the patient and patient inclusion and patient centricity. One of the questions here is, how does pharma and technology groups determine how to educate those patients on real world data and real world evidence? Feel free to take it, whoever sort of has more of a perspective here.
Well, I'm sure that we all have a perspective. Perhaps I'll jump in first, since I think it was initially targeted to industry at least. That's a very good question. I would say that generally speaking, even within our community, our oncology informatics or oncology health IT community, however you want to slice it, that sometimes the level of understanding of different real world data sources, their strengths and limitations, the fact that real world evidence is in fact a distinct thing from the underlying data, those are challenging for experts in the field sometimes. And so, of course, it can be challenging for some patients to understand those same concepts. However, of course, there have been a number of patient-led initiatives where it's been, science that's been driven by patients or their family members who really utilize real-world sources to make interesting discoveries of their own. I think in terms of education, we tend to think about that through working with patient advocacy groups, so that there are already channels where patients are speaking with each other and with the advocacy organization. But what we could do is to add general value about the strengths of real world evidence, how it applies to them as a patient, and also use that material. So for example, Susan G. Komen has a kind of train the trainer perspective, wherein faculty can come in and teach the patient advocates that have been selected about real world data, about real world evidence, about privacy considerations, and many other things, so that then those patient advocates are empowered to go and use that material and their own experience to then advocate and educate fellow patients. I'm sure that Jeff and Sean also have a perspective on this, though.
I think, Lauren hits on a critical point here that, part of the role of education is not just to provide patients the baseline knowledge of how to adjudicate between different data sources. I think most probably may not be interested in that. They should certainly have access to it, but I think in most instances, patients who are seeking more information about their care options are looking for any reliable information. And so as a community, I think, we have to take that quite seriously and ensure that the information that is reaching them is indeed, reliable. But one of the goals here, to Lauren's point, should be to raise the awareness of, the opportunities that are coming with data, how it can be used safely. Most patients are not the bottleneck in the challenge of sharing and obtaining their data. Most people would be very excited to know that their data is being used to improve the cures of tomorrow. In fact, most would probably be disappointed to think that their data is not informing that. So if there's ways that they can be part of that system and that approach to make it more reliable and sustainable into the future, I think that's a terrific goal to have, that one that I think patients and advocacy organizations would be thrilled to be a part of.
That makes sense. I think, in terms of what technology can do, I think what Lauren and Jeff said, they hit the nail on the head. And the way I think of it is really starting to shift focus away from what I, as a clinical researcher, think is important to the patient, to what actually the patient thinks is important to them. Having the patient tell me, as I'm designing a protocol, is it more important to them that their tumor goes from 10 centimeters in the longest diameter to 5 centimeters? Or is it more important to them to have an improvement in their baseline physical functional capacity? So because everything that we're guessing that, the tumor shrinking from 10 centimeters to 5 centimeters is important, but we don't really know. And to start to incorporate the voice of the patient in terms of how we design endpoints. For example, is it important to the patient that the LDL goes from 150 to 80, or is it important to them that they can jog a little longer? And as we start to incorporate those patient-centered endpoints, and what technology can do very beautifully, and we've already seen this in the financial markets, GameStop, no matter what you think, is the voice of the unheard speaking, challenging the status quo. Huge hedge funds and financial firms, whether that's right or wrong, it's a separate question, but technology gives voice to the voiceless. And I think we have a magnificent opportunity right now to use technology to better reflect the voice of the patient in how we design clinical research, how we define our endpoints, and how we also deliver care at the other end of the spectrum.
Wonderful, thank you. So as I'm looking at the rest of the questions, a lot of them are actually future focused, and with a couple of minutes left, then maybe I will leave the floor to the panelists to share with us one thing that they're willing to sort of bet or prognosticate on in the next 5 to 10 years. Sean, I'd love to know the GME price in the next 5 to 10 years. Within the context of oncology and real world data, what is one thing that you bet will happen in the very near future? And Jeff, let's start with you.
Sure. I think I would have to bet that perhaps data might become even more complicated before it becomes simpler. But I think that's well-intentioned to try and, do even more than, what's been described today or is happening in practice around linking different data sources together, which I think will be a very fruitful opportunity in thinking about how to paint this more holistic picture about the experience with different medical products. So I think it's absolutely worthwhile. but there will likely be a lot of complexities that will be encountered. I think they'll be ironed out in the long run, but we might have a few more hills to get over in the next couple of years.
Got it. And Lauren, what's it for you?
Completely agree with Jeff on data becoming more complicated as we have more and more channels and technologies to help access and link it. I think also methods, there are a number of methodological challenges right now that I think at least some of which will be tackled. I guess just shifting gear though, there was a statistic shared at the ACCC conference this year that showed that in a community practice, I think 50% of patients were still largely using telemedicine for their care. Now, will that be the case when we are post-pandemic or quasi back to normal? Remains to be seen, but I think telemedicine is likely to play an increasingly important role. Equally speaking, I think the decreased cost and new types of certain genetic tests will really shift what we're doing. So for example, the so-called liquid biopsies, where you can take a patient's blood specimen and look for DNA or RNA that's coming from a cancer, even if you can't see that as registering within a digital image from an MRI or a CT scan. That is very exciting if that technology is proven out, and will, I think, really begin to shift the industry in terms of how we think about the problems that we can tackle. And then from a real world data perspective, of course, it opens up new ways of thinking and new problems to address.
Well, thanks, Lauren and Sean.
I think we're going to see further blurring of the line between clinical research and care delivery, and we're going to see more pragmatic clinical trials. I think Lauren mentioned pragmatic trials as one of the stepping stones to what I believe is democratization of clinical research. Our parent organization, ASCO, has had tremendous success launching and managing one of the largest pragmatic clinical trials in oncology in the world. It's called TAPER, which is conducted at the point of care, flexible, broad eligibility criteria, and it is molecularly driven. It's quite sophisticated, the types of patients that are being treated as part of this pragmatic clinical trial that is now quite large. So I think we're going to see increasing democratization of clinical research to the point of care. As that happens, I believe and I hope that the cost of clinical development is going to decrease or stabilize, which leaves more room for innovation at the discovery end. So all in all, I think things look very promising.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much for your perspectives and for the participants and our audience today for your thoughtful questions. I guess to summarize, if I'm to give my own bet and prognostication, I'd love to see a world where even 5 to 10 years from now, we have every patient be able to be a participant in clinical development and research in some way, shape, or form. And I think we can get real world data to really provide a holistic view of a patient and do so. With that in mind and with that challenge, I hope that the group here will be great participants to getting that to happen. Thanks so much, everyone, and hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.